There is something about underground spaces that messes with your sense of ownership. Above ground, the rules feel obvious. Your fence is your fence. Your driveway is your driveway. Your front door is your front door. You can see those edges. You can point to them. You can stand at the boundary and say, definitively, this side is mine, that side is yours. The surface world is legible. Property signs, fences, recorded lots, everything above grade is mapped and visible and contested only when someone makes the conscious decision to contest it. But go 6 feet down and something shifts in people's minds. Like the earth itself becomes neutral territory. Like depth creates ambiguity. Like the fact that you cannot see it from the road means it belongs to whoever found the door first. Cities are built on layers, utility lines, old foundations, forgotten infrastructure from earlier decades, and most people navigate above all of it without ever thinking about who owns what beneath them. Most of the time, that lack of awareness is harmless. Occasionally, it is not. Because some people do not just have a vague sense that underground space is nobody's business. Some people have a plan for it. Some people look at what is below grade and see not ambiguity but opportunity, a resource that exists outside the visible map, available to anyone willing to use it quietly enough that the person above it never knows. That logic is wrong. It is legally wrong, morally wrong, and in this case, spectacularly and expensively wrong for one HOA president who made the mistake of treating a private tunnel like a personal shortcut and found out exactly what happens when the person who owns that tunnel decides they have had enough. This story starts with a house, and a tunnel, and a woman named Sandra who had a very specific idea about what the word community meant. The property sat at the edge of what locals called the old commercial strip, a stretch of town that had been, at various points in its history, a produce market, a warehouse corridor, and eventually a neighborhood. The kind of neighborhood that gets built on top of commercial bones, where the foundations of old buildings get absorbed into new ones, where things exist underneath that nobody who moved in after 1995 has any idea about. The tunnel was one of those things. It had been built in the mid-1940s, back when the block operated as a combined warehouse and retail strip. Delivery infrastructure ran underground to keep the surface streets clear. Goods would come in from the loading side, travel below grade, and surface wherever they needed to go. Practical. Simple. The kind of civil engineering solution that made perfect sense in 1944 and became completely invisible by 1985. When Marcus bought the property, the tunnel was disclosed in the deed. It was part of the lot's historical documentation. And underground passage, dimensions recorded, entry and exit points mapped. It sat entirely within his property lines. Both access points were on his land. The passage crossed under his yard, beneath a portion of his foundation, and terminated at a cellar-level entry inside a storage structure he used for equipment. It did not go anywhere near the HOA's common area. It did not share a wall with any neighboring property. It was his, fully, legally, documented since 1944 his. He mostly used it for storage. Sometimes he would run extension cords through it in winter. It was dry, it was cool, and it kept certain equipment out of the elements. It was quirky in the way that old properties are quirky, a feature you mention to people at dinner parties, and they raise their eyebrows and say, "A tunnel, really?" And you shrug and say, "Yeah, it is from the 40s," and move on. He had owned the house for 11 years. He knew the property the way you know something you have lived inside for over a decade, not as a thing to be studied, but as a daily reality. He knew which section of the back fence needed tightening every spring. He knew the tunnel let in a thin smell of salt air in August when the coastal humidity reached a certain level. He knew the storage structure door swelled in its frame after rain, and you had to lift slightly while turning the handle. He did not think about the tunnel as something worth protecting because it had never occurred to him that it needed protection. It was in his deed. It was in his deed. It was in his soil. The idea that someone else might have been using it, quietly, for months, that thought had not crossed his mind. Not until the sound. It started with a sound. Not a dramatic sound. Not a crash or a bang. A low, rhythmic thumping, the kind that could be footsteps or pipes or any number of things in an old house. Except it was coming from the wrong direction, from below the main living area. from the part of the foundation where the tunnel ran. Marcus had lived in the house for 11 years by that point. He knew its sounds. He knew which radiators knocked in November, which stair creaked at the third step, which window in the back bedroom rattled when wind came from the northwest. He knew the particular silence of the storage structure after midnight, a heavy underground quiet that was different from the rest of the house's quiet. He did not know this sound, and he did not like not knowing it. He set up a camera in the storage structure. A basic motion-activated unit aimed at the tunnel entry door. He was not particularly alarmed at that point. He was curious. Maybe there was an animal getting in somehow. Maybe the old door had warped and was catching in the frame during temperature swings. Old properties throw surprises. You investigate before you escalate. What the camera showed him was not an animal. Over the course of 4 days, the camera recorded 11 separate entries into his private subterranean passage. Delivery personnel carrying packages. In some clips, 2 or 3 people at a time. Moving quickly, efficiently, not like people who were lost or confused, but like people who had been doing this for a while. People who knew where they were going. People who expected the door to be unlocked because it always was. He watched the footage twice. Then he sat with it for a moment. Then he thought about when this had started. He thought about it carefully, not rushing toward outrage, but mapping the timeline. There were things that should have been signals, in retrospect. A period several months back when the storage structure door had seemed to develop a new wear pattern on the frame, something he would attributed to seasonal movement. A night when he would found the rear gate unlatched in a way he would assumed was his own oversight. Small things. The kind of small things that only become legible when you have a context that explains them. He went back through 11 months of his motion sensor logs from the perimeter cameras on his property, cameras that faced outward, toward the street and the alley, not the storage structure, looking for patterns in the rear gate. He found them. A recurring time window mid-morning on weekdays, sometimes Saturdays. Consistent enough to be scheduled. Invisible enough, in isolation, to mean nothing. Put together, it was a map. Someone had looked at his property, identified the tunnel, and built a delivery schedule around it. He was not a participant in this schedule. He was the infrastructure it ran through. He spent an evening just sitting with that. Not strategizing. Not preparing. Just absorbing the specific quality of the violation, not violent, not chaotic, but methodical. Planned. Someone had looked at what he owned and decided it was available. Sandra Voss had become HOA president 14 months earlier. She had run on a platform of community efficiency, which, in her interpretation, meant streamlining everything. Garbage pickup routes, mail delivery, package distribution, which had become a real logistical headache as online shopping volumes tripled and the narrow streets of the old commercial strip created constant delivery bottlenecks. The neighborhood was in a coastal town. Summer population swelled by about 40,000 people. The full-time resident count was around 8,000. In July and August, the character of the streets changed completely. Delivery volumes were, by any reasonable estimate, insane. The trucks double-parked. The vans blocked intersections. Amazon drivers would sometimes sit on a single block for 20 minutes trying to sort packages while tourist traffic backed up behind them, horns building towards something nobody wanted to reach. Sandra had apparently decided that Marcus's tunnel was the solution to this problem. Not her tunnel. Not a tunnel she had any legal relationship to whatsoever. His tunnel, which she had apparently identified, either through the deed records that HOA boards sometimes request access to, or through some more direct method of investigation, as a subterranean shortcut that could bypass 2 of the worst delivery choke points on the strip. She had not asked Marcus. She had not proposed an easement. She had not come to him with a formal request through the HOA's documented process, or any process, formal or informal. She had simply, and this is the part that takes a moment to fully absorb, started routing deliveries through it, coordinated with delivery drivers, given them access instructions, made it a feature of the neighborhood's logistics without ever once acknowledging that it was not her property to feature. For somewhere between 8 and 14 months, Marcus's private tunnel had been functioning as unofficial community delivery infrastructure, and he had not known. She had counted on him not knowing. That was the plan. Here is what is interesting about that gap: 8 to 14 months of not knowing. Most people, when they find out something like this has been happening, experience the timeline as an affront. The duration becomes its own outrage. How long were they doing this? How did I not notice? What else is happening that I do not know about? Marcus did feel those things. Of course he did. 14 months of your private property being used without your knowledge, without your consent, without any compensation or conversation, that is a violation that sits in you in a specific way. It is not just that the thing happened. It is that it happened so completely beneath your awareness, so deliberately beneath your awareness. But once the initial shock passed, he felt something more specific. He felt the shape of Sandra's plan. Because she had not just started using the tunnel. She had made it load-bearing. She had built it into the logistics chain of the neighborhood's delivery system in a way that, by the time anyone noticed, would be very difficult to simply remove. A dozen drivers had the access point memorized. The routing algorithms, the actual software that certain major carriers use to calculate optimal paths, had been fed the shortcut over repeated use. The tunnel was not just being used. It had become necessary. And the moment it became necessary was the moment Sandra would have had real leverage. Because at that point, taking it back would have consequences. Real, visible, economically painful consequences. Sandra could have stood in front of the HOA board and said, "We have been using this efficient route for over a year. Disrupting it now would harm the whole community. We should formalize it." A recorded easement. A community vote. A legal structure built on top of an illegal foundation, the foundation laundered into legitimacy by the simple passage of time. Marcus had walked right up to the edge of that trap. What Sandra had not calculated was who she was dealing with. Marcus spent 3 weeks doing something Sandra had apparently never considered doing: thorough research. He pulled the full chain of title on his property. He reviewed every recorded document associated with his deed going back to 1938. He studied the original subdivision plats from the commercial strip's development years, tracking how the lot lines had been drawn when the warehouse and retail operations were divided among multiple owners. He researched the history of subterranean easements in his jurisdiction, how they had historically been granted, what language the granting documents typically used, what the absence of that language in a title chain implied. Then he contacted a real estate attorney who specialized in subterranean property rights. That is a narrow field, and the narrowness of it matters. Most property attorneys handle surface issues, boundary disputes, easements for driveways and utility lines, fence encroachments. Subsurface litigation is less common in residential contexts and requires someone who understands both the property law and the geological and structural surveying requirements that come with establishing underground boundary lines with the precision courts require. The attorney's findings were exactly what the deed had always said. The tunnel was entirely within Marcus's property lines. Both access points, the one in the storage structure and the one at the far end near what was now an equipment shed, sat within land recorded in his name. There was no easement anywhere in the title chain, no access agreement, no shared use provision from the 1940s when the commercial strip was originally divided. More specifically, there was no prescriptive easement. The doctrine of prescriptive easement, the legal theory by which someone can acquire the right to use your land if they do so openly, continuously, and without permission for a statutory period, had not been satisfied. The use had been concealed, not open. It had been unauthorized from the start. The statutory period in his jurisdiction ran 15 years. 14 months did not come close. The attorney also reviewed the question from a different angle: the attractive nuisance doctrine. There is an argument, and it is real enough that Sandra's eventual legal team tried versions of it, that an open, accessible underground tunnel constitutes an attractive nuisance that the property owner has some obligation to secure. The counter-argument is that the attractive nuisance doctrine was designed for children, not adult commercial operators who were deliberately using a private shortcut they would been routed to by an HOA president. Courts have consistently held that the intentional commercial use of a property by knowledgeable adults who understood perfectly well that they were using someone's private access point does not convert that use into an attractive nuisance scenario. The doctrine requires lack of awareness of the risk. These drivers knew exactly where they were going. Another argument Sandra's team floated was laches and estoppel. The theory goes, if Marcus had known about the use and failed to object for a significant period, perhaps he should be legally barred from suddenly stopping it when the timing became maximally disruptive. The estoppel argument had a surface appeal. It sounds like fairness. But estoppel requires actual knowledge and actual silence in the face of that knowledge. Marcus had not known. The use had been deliberately concealed from him. You cannot be estopped from asserting a right based on your failure to object to something you did not know was happening. Sandra had built her system too fast and too quietly. Both of those things worked against her in ways she apparently had not thought through. The attorney's letter was 3 paragraphs. It was polite and precise and utterly devastating to any argument that the HOA had any legal relationship to the tunnel whatsoever. Marcus kept a copy in his filing cabinet and sent certified copies to Sandra, the HOA board, and the HOA's legal counsel of record. He gave them 30 days to cease all access. Sandra's response arrived in the form of an HOA board meeting agenda item titled Community Infrastructure Access Dispute. She was not conceding. She was escalating. The board meeting was, by multiple accounts, remarkable. Sandra arrived with what she described as documentation of community benefit, a packet that included delivery time comparisons showing the tunnel route saved an average of 11 minutes per delivery during peak season, resident satisfaction surveys she had apparently commissioned without board authorization, and a rough economic analysis suggesting the shortcut generated community value in the range of $4,000 per tourist season. She did not include any documentation suggesting she had the legal right to use the property, because there was not any. What she argued, essentially, was that the community benefit outweighed the property rights, that the tunnel's use had become so integrated into the neighborhood's functioning that asking drivers to stop would cause real and meaningful disruption, that Marcus, as a member of the community himself, should consider what the collective good required. What was remarkable about the meeting, and this detail matters, was not just what Sandra argued, but how some of the board members reacted to it. A few of them had not known. The HOA president had been routing deliveries through a private tunnel for over a year without telling the board. The people nominally in charge of the organization Sandra represented had been operating in the dark alongside Marcus. When they learned this in the meeting, their reactions ranged from awkward silence to visible discomfort. One board member asked a direct question. Did we vote on this? Sandra's answer was essentially that it was an operational decision within her authority to manage community logistics, not a policy decision requiring a vote. The board member did not push back audibly, but the expression on their face by multiple accounts did the work. The argument Sandra was making has a name in legal philosophy. It is called the utilitarian takings argument, the idea that private property rights can be subordinated when the collective benefit is sufficiently large. It is the reasoning that underlies eminent domain. It has a long and genuinely contentious history in American property law, with serious scholars on multiple sides of it. But it requires one thing that Sandra had entirely and completely skipped: governmental authority. The government can condemn your property for public use. The government can exercise eminent domain, forcing a sale at fair market value for a public purpose. That power exists. It has legal constraints and procedural requirements, but it exists and has been tested in courts for over a century. Sandra was not the government. She was an HOA president. HOA presidents do not possess eminent domain authority. HOA presidents cannot compel property owners to absorb the cost of a community logistics system built on their land without consent. The community benefit argument, deployed without governmental authority and without compensation, is just a polite way of saying someone else's needs should override your rights. And that is not how rights work in a legal system that takes property ownership seriously. Marcus sat through the meeting. He listened to every word. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not escalate. He just looked at his calendar. Tourist season opened in 6 weeks. This is the part of the story where geography becomes essential, so stay with it for a moment. The town was coastal. Its economy ran on approximately 3 months of summer traffic. June through August, with peak weeks concentrated around the 4th of July and early August, when 3 different regional festivals overlapped. In those peak weeks, delivery volume in the commercial strip increased by roughly 300% over baseline. Restaurants received daily supplies by the truckload. Vacation rental properties needed linens, cleaning supplies, welcome packages. Retail stores ran near continuous restocking. The demand was real, the timing was compressed, and the margin for logistical error during peak weeks was essentially zero. You miss a delivery window during festival weekend, you are not getting another one until Monday. Sandra's delivery routing ran through Marcus's tunnel for approximately 200 meters. Those 200 meters bypassed what locals called the Triangle Gridlock, a 3-way intersection where 2 major delivery routes and the main tourist corridor collided during peak hours. Avoiding the triangle saved 11 minutes per delivery run. During tourist season, some regular drivers made that run 6 to 8 times per day. The math was not complicated. 6 runs times 11 minutes equals 66 minutes per driver per day. Across all drivers using the route across the full season, the accumulated time savings Sandra had engineered were real and measurable. Remove the tunnel. Add 11 minutes per run. Multiply by frequency. Multiply by number of drivers. The result was not just inconvenient, it was a cascading logistical failure that would become visible and expensive immediately and stay that way for months. Sandra knew this. She had built the system knowing this. The fact that removing it would hurt was not an accident. It was load-bearing architecture, and she had designed it that way. Marcus filed for a formal injunction against continued use of his property on the 14th day of his 30-day notice period, 2 weeks before Sandra's deadline, 1 week after the board meeting. The injunction filing was public record. The HOA's legal counsel responded with a motion to delay, citing ongoing community impact assessment. Marcus did not wait for the assessment. He hired a contractor. There are 2 ways to close a tunnel. The first is a temporary barrier, a physical door, a padlocked gate, a concrete block placed at the access point. Removable. Reversible. Something that sends the message stop, but does not say gone. It is a statement that can be argued with, legally and physically. A barrier can be removed. A barrier can be challenged in court while remaining intact. A barrier invites the question of whether it will last. The second is a structural seal. Concrete poured into the access shaft and allowed to cure. The door framed over, drywalled, finished. The opening converted permanently into a storage wall, which Marcus happened to need anyway, the newly sealed space becoming useful real estate rather than a point of vulnerability. This was not reversible without significant and expensive demolition. This was not a statement. It was a fact. It was the kind of action that ends a conversation rather than continuing one. Marcus chose the second option. He scheduled the work for the Friday before Memorial Day weekend, the traditional start of tourist season in his region. He had the contractor bid the job, confirm the timeline, and pull the necessary permits. Everything documented. Everything above board. He was not, at any point in this process, doing anything that was not entirely within his legal rights and entirely compliant with local building codes. The date was not chosen for drama. Marcus did not particularly think of himself as a dramatic person. He chose Memorial Day weekend for a specific and practical reason. It was the last date on which the seal could be in place before the first major delivery surge of the season. If he waited until after Memorial Day, the tunnel would be used through another full peak period while the legal process worked its way through the system. His injunction was filed. The process would eventually resolve in his favor. But eventually is not immediately, and in the meantime his property would continue to be used. He was not willing to let that happen. The contractor arrived at 7 in the morning on Friday. By 2 in the afternoon, both access points had been permanently sealed. The entry in the storage structure was drywalled to the studs. The far entry at the equipment shed was backfilled and landscaped. Neither point showed any trace of the original opening. Marcus sent a brief email to the HOA board at 2:17 p.m. Please be advised that trespass on my property at address has been permanently remediated as of today. All delivery routing should be updated accordingly. The contractor's completion certificate is attached for your records. He went inside and made coffee. What happened next happened fast, the way things always happen when you pull a load-bearing support out of a structure that was never supposed to depend on it. The first delivery gridlock at the Triangle intersection occurred on Saturday morning of Memorial Day weekend, less than 18 hours after the seal was completed. A refrigerated truck carrying restaurant supplies, a FedEx van with rental property packages, and a tourist shuttle all converged on the intersection within 4 minutes of each other. The resulting backup extended for 7 blocks. By the time it cleared, nearly 40 minutes had passed, and 2 delivery drivers had given up and rerouted entirely, pushing their loads to late afternoon windows that then collided with the evening restaurant rush. By Sunday, 3 restaurant operators had contacted the HOA demanding to know what had happened to the delivery route. By the delivery route, they meant a private underground passage on a private property that they had apparently been told was a community asset. When Sandra had to explain what had actually happened, that the tunnel was privately owned, that she had been routing deliveries through it without the owner's knowledge, and that the owner had now sealed it, the response from the restaurant operators was not sympathetic. The HOA board held an emergency session on Tuesday. Sandra did not provide advance notice to Marcus. The session resulted in a formal vote. 5 members present, 3 votes to pursue legal remediation of access, 2 votes to drop the matter entirely. The 2 members who voted to drop the matter later told a mutual acquaintance of Marcus's that they had done the math. The HOA's legal liability exposure from the unauthorized use was, at that point, significant. Sandra had acted entirely outside her authority. She had coordinated third-party access to a private subterranean structure without board approval, without legal review, without any form of disclosure to the board or to Marcus. The HOA was not just trying to get the tunnel back. The HOA was simultaneously trying to avoid being named in a trespass lawsuit that could cost considerably more than any efficiency gain from the shortcut had ever been worth. The 3 who voted to pursue legal action did so because Sandra convinced them the prescriptive easement argument still had legs. It did not have legs. Here is the thing about prescriptive easements that keeps colliding with Sandra's argument, no matter how you approach it. The requirements are specific and conjunctive, meaning all of them have to be satisfied simultaneously, not just some of them. Partial compliance does not get you partial credit. The use must be actual, meaning physically demonstrated. The use must be open and notorious, meaning known or knowable to the property owner. The use must be continuous and uninterrupted for the full statutory period without meaningful gap. And critically, the use must be hostile and adverse, meaning without the property owner's permission, and without the owner's acquiescence to a degree that might suggest implied permission. Sandra's use satisfied actual. It failed almost everything else. Open and notorious. Marcus had not known about it for 14 months. The use had been deliberately routed through an access point that was not visible from the main house. The storage structure entry sat at the rear of the property behind a privacy fence, accessible from an alley that Marcus used infrequently. The entry was not marked. It was not advertised. Delivery drivers had been given access instructions that did not include any communication with the property owner. The use was, if anything, carefully designed to remain invisible to the person whose property it occupied. Open and notorious does not mean only that the use was physically happening. It means the owner could reasonably have been expected to know about it, that it was visible enough, prominent enough, that a reasonable property owner paying ordinary attention would have detected it. Marcus had ordinary security measures, ordinary perimeter awareness, ordinary occupant attention to his property. He had not detected the use. The argument that he should have detected it earlier, or that his failure to detect it implies acquiescence, falls apart when the use was engineered to evade detection. Continuous. Marcus sealed the tunnel after 14 months. Courts have consistently held that the statutory period must run uninterrupted all the way through. The sealing disrupted continuity permanently and definitively. The statutory period itself, 15 years in this jurisdiction. 14 months does not reach 5% of the requirement. There is no legal theory that converts 14 months into 15 years by virtue of economic importance or community benefit. Sandra's attorney apparently explained the actual state of the law to her sometime around the third week of June, because the HOA's motion to pursue legal remediation was quietly withdrawn without a hearing, without a court filing, without any formal acknowledgement that they were stopping. The agenda item simply stopped appearing on meeting schedules. Marcus received a certified letter in July. It was from the HOA's insurance carrier. It contained a settlement offer related to the documented unauthorized use of his property, a figure that covered his legal fees, the cost of the seal work, and a reasonable documented amount for the trespass itself, calculated across the 14 months of unauthorized use at a per-entry rate. He accepted. He used the money to repave his driveway and build new shelving in the storage structure, the former tunnel entry now a smooth, finished wall behind neat rows of organized equipment. Sandra Voss was not removed from the HOA board that year. She finished her term. She did not run for a second one. What did happen in the months following the tunnel dispute was that several other property owners in the community started pulling their deed documentation and actually reading it. The dispute had been public enough, visible enough in the community's social fabric and in the summer's logistics failures that people got curious, started asking questions they had not thought to ask before. What exactly does the HOA have authority over? Where does the authority end? What is the difference between a community rule and a legal right? Some of what they found was uncomfortable. Not illegal in most cases, but uncomfortable in the way that unexamined assumptions become uncomfortable when you finally look at them directly. Interpretations of the community covenants that had expanded over years in ways the original documents had not intended or specified. Common area maintenance decisions that had been made without the formal votes the bylaws required. Access assumptions about pathways and shortcuts and traditional routes that had calcified over years into unexamined habits that nobody had ever actually authorized. One property owner discovered that a storage shed she would been told was on common area was actually within her deed's boundary lines by approximately 4 feet. She would been paying to maintain infrastructure on her own land under the impression that the HOA owned it. Another discovered that an assessment for a community landscaping project had been applied to lots that, per the governing documents, were explicitly exempt from that category of assessment. Nothing as stark as a private tunnel being used as a delivery corridor. But the pattern that tunnel represented, the quiet expansion of institutional authority into spaces where it had no legal right to be, justified by convenience and efficiency and the comfort of nobody looking closely, that pattern was there in smaller form throughout the community. It had been there for a while. It had just never had a case visible enough, and expensive enough, and cleanly enough documented to make people look. The tunnel dispute had a secondary effect that Sandra had not planned for. It made property owners in the community substantially more attentive to the specific language of their documents. Not hostile, not litigious, just attentive. Reading what they would sign, understanding what it meant, knowing the difference between what the HOA was authorized to do and what it was in the habit of doing. Those are not the same thing. They should never have been assumed to be. Before we get to the automation angle, let us step back from this specific case and look at the pattern it sits inside. Because Sandra Voss did not invent anything. She inherited something. HOA governing documents, the CC&Rs, the bylaws, the rules and regulations, are written at the time the community is formed. They describe the world as it exists then, with the authority structures that make sense then. A developer creates a community, writes the founding documents, sells the properties, and hands governance over to the homeowners. At that point, the documents are a fairly accurate description of what the HOA is supposed to do and what authority it has to do it. Then time passes. People interpret the documents. Traditions develop. Habits calcify. And slowly, in ways that are almost impossible to track in real time, the gap between what the documents actually say and what the board actually does begins to widen. Legal scholars call this phenomenon covenant creep. It is not a conspiracy. It is not usually intentional overreach. It is the gradual accumulation of small decisions, each one defensible in isolation, that over time adds up to an institution operating well outside the authority granted to it by its founding documents. The trajectory usually looks something like this. A board president decides to handle something informally because the formal process is slow. The informal handling works. It becomes the precedent. The next president references the precedent rather than the document. Over time, the precedent becomes the document in practice, even though the actual document says something different or says nothing at all. In residential communities across the country, there are HOA boards exercising authority over things their governing documents never mentioned. Architectural decisions that the documents left to homeowners. Maintenance obligations that the documents never created. Access assumptions built on decades of unchallenged habit. The authority feels real because it has been exercised for long enough that nobody remembers when it was established or whether it ever was. Sandra was operating in this tradition. She was not, in her own mind, reaching outside the legitimate scope of her authority. She was problem-solving the way HOA presidents have always problem-solved, by identifying what needed to happen and making it happen, using whatever resources were available. The fact that one of those resources happened to be private property she had no legal right to use was, from her perspective, a technicality. That perspective is not unique to Sandra. It is the perspective that covenant creep produces over time. A belief that because the board has always done something, it has the right to keep doing it. A belief that community benefit is sufficient justification for administrative action. A belief that the formal legal constraints in the founding documents are flaws, not ceilings, minimums, not limits. The irony is that this exact dynamic is what makes HOA disputes feel so strange to outsiders. The homeowner who objects to what the board is doing is usually right, legally. The board president who insists on doing it usually has precedent, tradition, and the support of enough community members to feel legitimate. Both things can be true simultaneously. The legal reality and the social reality can point in completely opposite directions. Marcus's dispute worked out the way it did because he understood the difference between those two realities and chose to operate in the legal one. He did not argue with Sandra about the social traditions of the community. He did not try to make the case that his needs outweighed the community's convenience in the court of neighborhood opinion. He went to the actual documents. He hired the actual attorney. He sent the actual certified letters. That is not the path most homeowners choose, and there are understandable reasons why. It is expensive. It is adversarial. It damages relationships that you have to continue living near. It requires a level of research and documentation that most people do not have time for. And there is always the nagging social cost of being the person who would not cooperate, who would not be flexible, who made everything harder than it needed to be. Marcus paid that cost. He calculated that it was cheaper than the alternative. He was right. Let us talk about what actually happened underground here, because there is a layer to this story that is easy to miss. The automation angle. When Sandra routed deliveries through the tunnel, she did not just tell a few drivers to use a shortcut. She built a system. And modern delivery logistics is not a manual operation, it runs on software. Route optimization algorithms used by major carriers calculate the most efficient paths between stops based on physical geography, historical travel time data, and driver input. When a path is usable and faster, it gets recommended. When drivers use a shortcut repeatedly and flag it as efficient, that data gets fed back into the optimization model. Over time, the shortcut stops being a tip one driver shares with another and starts being a route the system generates automatically. This matters because it reveals the actual scope of what Sandra had done. She had not just solved a delivery problem. She had not just helped some drivers save 11 minutes. She had created a data artifact, an entry in multiple logistics databases that represented Marcus's private property as available routing infrastructure. Every time a driver used the route and the trip time was logged, the algorithm's confidence in the shortcut increased. The system was being trained, with every delivery, to treat a private tunnel as a public resource. By the time Marcus sealed the tunnel, an unknown number of drivers across potentially several carrier systems had a routing that included a path through his property. These systems do not run title searches. They do not check property ownership records. They process physical geography and time efficiency. A path that exists, that is passable, and that saves measurable time will be recommended by the algorithm regardless of whether the path crosses private property, regardless of whether the owner has authorized the use, regardless of the legal status of the access. When the path closed, those systems had to recalibrate. Some did so quickly drivers would arrive at the sealed access point, find a smooth wall where a door used to be, manually reroute, and report the path as blocked, which would update the system. Others were slower. Some driver-entered shortcuts require manual review to remove from routing databases rather than automatically clearing from algorithm failures. The human-entered element of the shortcut meant the human removal process had to match it. Marcus had to send formal written notices to 3 separate carrier companies requesting removal of his property from their routing databases. One of those requests took 11 weeks to process and receive confirmation. 11 weeks during which drivers were still occasionally being directed to a sealed wall. He owns the ground. He sealed the tunnel. He had the legal documentation, the contractor certificates, the settlement agreement. And he still had to file paperwork to establish his ownership in a database that should not have had his property in it at all. That is what Sandra had actually built. Not just a habit among local drivers, not just a convenient shortcut, a data artifact that existed in multiple systems and would keep asserting the existence of a usable path long after the physical path was gone. Removing the unauthorized use required undoing the physical reality and then waiting for the data reality to catch up, one carrier at a time, one database update at a time. That is a new kind of property problem. It did not exist before routing algorithms existed. The ground was always his. But the representation of the ground in a delivery system, that representation had been created without his knowledge and had to be actively dismantled. When people think about trespass, they think about a person crossing a line. This was that, and also something more. It was an institution encoding a trespass as a feature, and features persist. The seasonal timing of the seal is worth sitting with longer than it usually gets, because it tends to be characterized as revenge, and that characterization misses what was actually happening. Marcus could have sealed the tunnel in March, when delivery volumes were minimal and the disruption would have been quiet and limited. He could have sealed it in October, well after tourist season wound down, when the stakes were low and Sandra's system was essentially dormant. Both options were available. He chose Memorial Day weekend instead. Here is why that matters beyond the obvious. Sandra's legal strategy at the board meeting had been to argue community benefit, to quantify the economic value of the tunnel's use as a way of building a case for either a formal easement or a compensated use arrangement. Her entire argument for maintaining access rested on demonstrating that the tunnel was valuable, that its disruption would cause meaningful harm, that the community's dependence on the route was real and significant. If Marcus had sealed the tunnel in March, Sandra's argument would have been hypothetical. She would be standing in front of a board, or eventually a judge, saying, "Trust me, this route matters, it saves 11 minutes, it would have been very important in July." The economic value would be a projection. The dependence would be theoretical. The harm would be anticipated rather than demonstrated. Sealing it Memorial Day weekend made the value undeniable, immediate, and visible to everyone simultaneously. The gridlock at the triangle intersection, the restaurant operators' complaints, the cascade of delayed deliveries during the first full tourist weekend of the season. All of that was not just inconvenience. It was documented proof, in real time, of exactly how much the routing system had come to depend on a private passage it had no right to use. The settlement calculation was informed by that documentation. The HOA's legal liability was priced against that documentation. The carrier's acknowledgement of the routing error was supported by that documentation. The timing was not cruelty. It was evidence generation. It made the trespass legible in a language that lawyers and insurance adjusters and logistics managers all speak fluently. It put a number on the cost of what Sandra had built on land she did not own. There is also a structural argument for the timing that has nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with protection. If Marcus had waited, if the legal process had dragged on through summer while deliveries continued through his tunnel, and if during those months something had gone wrong, the liability question would have been genuinely complex. A worker injured in an unauthorized passage on private property, a structural issue from commercial load weights the tunnel was not designed for, an incident during the high-volume period when the usage rate was 3 times normal. A property owner who knows their land is being trespassed upon, does nothing to stop it, and then faces an injury claim on that land. That is a complicated legal position to be in. The seal was not just about principle. It was about protection from liability that the unauthorized use was actively generating. One of the board members who voted to drop the matter, the one who had done the math on liability, spoke to Marcus later that summer at a neighborhood event. They stood near the edge of things, not quite in the main social current of the gathering, and had a brief conversation. Not hostile, not particularly warm, just two people acknowledging what had happened. The board member said, "The thing I keep coming back to is that Sandra never thought she was doing anything wrong. I genuinely believe that. She thought that because she was acting in the community's interest, the property question was secondary." Marcus considered this for a moment. "The problem," he said, "is that the community's interest was what she decided it was. I am also in the community." That exchange is short enough that it is easy to pass over, but it contains the core of what makes HOA disputes so persistently difficult to resolve, and why they so often escalate past the point where everyone involved would rather they had not. Sandra had not thought of herself as a trespasser. She had thought of herself as a problem solver. She had looked at a logistical challenge, the delivery congestion that genuinely made the neighborhood harder to live in during tourist season, and found an elegant solution. The solution happened to sit on someone else's property. She had apparently decided that the elegance of the solution, and the breadth of its benefit, justified not asking permission. That decision is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most common ways that institutional authority expands past its limits. Not through malice. Through the unconscious assumption that a person's administrative role grants them not just the authority to manage what is in their jurisdiction, but the right to define what falls within their jurisdiction in the first place. HOA governance is, at its best, a mechanism for collective coordination. Shared spaces need maintenance. Community rules need enforcement. Common resources need management. None of that works without someone exercising judgment about what serves the community. That judgment exercising role has to exist. But the power to exercise judgment for the community is not the same as the power to override individual rights in the name of the community. Those are different things, and the distance between them matters enormously in practice. An HOA board has authority over the common areas listed in the community documents. It has authority to enforce rules established in those documents that bind all homeowners through the recorded covenants they agreed to when they purchased. It has authority within those limits. It does not have authority over private property that is not mentioned in the governing documents. It does not have the power to repurpose private assets for community use without an agreement. It does not have the right to build systems that depend on access it has not obtained, and then argue that the dependence of those systems creates an obligation on the property owner to sustain them. Sandra had mistaken authority over the community for authority over everything the community touched. Those are not the same thing. The community touches every property in the neighborhood. That does not make every property in the neighborhood subject to the HOA's discretion. What Marcus did, which is less simple than it sounds, was hold that line clearly and without compromise. He could have negotiated. He could have accepted a small easement fee and let the deliveries continue. He could have traded the disruption for some combination of compensation and community goodwill. People do those things. They are not unreasonable choices. He chose not to, because the question was not only about this tunnel. It was about whether unauthorized use, once established and made economically significant, becomes a de facto right. Whether the investment a party puts into a system they built on your property transfers any ownership of that property to them. Whether silence and unawareness over time erode the owner's standing to say no. The answer to all of those questions is no. And the only way that answer stays meaningful is if it is actually enforced. There is a legal doctrine called quius est solum. Ius est usque ad coelum et ad inferos. The Latin translates roughly as, whoever owns the soil, it is theirs all the way to heaven and all the way to hell. It is one of the oldest principles in common law property rights. It sounds almost theological, which is fitting. Property law at its roots is theology in legal dress. The conviction that ownership is meaningful, that it creates a real and defensible boundary between what is yours and what belongs to others, that that boundary generates obligations for everyone who encounters it to respect it. In modern practice, the doctrine has been modified by necessity. Property rights do not extend infinitely upward in an age of aviation. They do not extend infinitely downward in a world where mineral rights and utility infrastructure create layered ownership structures. The absolutism of the original maxim has been shaped and limited by the complex practical demands of shared space. But the core of it survives. The presumption runs toward the property owner. If you want to use someone's land above it, below it, across its surface, you need a legal basis to do so. An easement, a recorded agreement, a statutory right, a formal governmental taking with compensation. You do not get to simply begin using it and then argue that your use created a right. That is not how rights work in a legal system that takes ownership seriously. That is how squatting works. And even squatting has requirements, years of visible, continuous, adverse possession that Sandra had not come close to meeting. She had a plan and an assumption. The plan was genuinely elegant. The assumption was that elegance justifies itself. It does not. It never does. After the settlement, after the tourist season wound down, after the routing databases were finally updated, and the last carrier confirmed removal of his property from their systems, Marcus had a decision to make about the sealed space. Both access points were closed. The tunnel itself still existed. 200 meters of dry underground corridor, mid-century construction, solid walls tested for structural integrity during the contractor's assessment. He was not reopening it. But the space was still there, still his, still part of the property he would owned for 11 years. He converted part of it into a wine cellar. The section near the storage structure, first 20 feet in from the sealed entry point, consistent temperature year-round, good drainage, stone walls that had been assessed as structurally sound. He had new shelving built, proper climate monitoring, a clean interior access from inside the storage building through a door he chose and installed on his own terms, with locks he chose, opening on a schedule he determined. A friend visited the following summer, and Marcus showed him the space. The friend stood among the wine racks, looked at the stone walls, and laughed. "This is the tunnel, the one she was routing packages through?" "Same one." The friend shook his head slowly. "You turned her delivery corridor into a wine cellar." Marcus shrugged. "I turned my tunnel back into my tunnel. What I do with it after that is my own business." There is something worth noting about that phrase, "my tunnel back into my tunnel." The back is doing work there, because it was always his tunnel. What changed was not the ownership. What changed was the practice of ownership. What changed was the active assertion of what the deed had said since 1944. That gap between ownership as a legal fact and ownership as a lived daily reality is where most property disputes actually live. Most of the time, ownership just means the house exists around you and the deed sits in a filing cabinet and the property taxes get paid. You are not actively defending anything because nothing is being contested. The ownership is theoretical in the best possible way, complete, unquestioned background. But when someone else starts treating your property as a resource they can use, ownership stops being background and becomes something you have to actively inhabit. You have to pull the deed out of the cabinet. You have to read the documents. You have to understand what you own and why. You have to decide how much you are willing to let go of and for how much. And you have to make those decisions under social pressure that runs the other way. That is a real cost. It takes time and money and stress and the particular discomfort of being in conflict with people you live near. It changes the texture of your daily life in ways that are hard to put a number on. But the alternative, letting the passive use continue, hoping the formal claim never materializes, giving up a piece of what you legally own to avoid the friction, that has costs too, costs that compound over time. Costs that eventually become harder to reverse than the original dispute would have been. Because the longer an unauthorized use continues, the more integrated it becomes into other systems, the more load-bearing it becomes in the planning of the person using it, the harder the conversation is when it finally happens. And eventually, it always happens. You can delay the conversation. You cannot prevent it. Marcus had calculated those costs clearly. He had made a choice, and the wine cellar, 3 seasons later, was the quiet visible result of that choice. The tunnel converted from a corridor through which other people moved freely into a space where he kept things he chose to keep, accessible to no one but himself, organized to suit his own purposes. The chaos of that first tourist weekend, the gridlock, and the complaints, and the emergency board session, all of that had long faded into background. What remained was a room that smelled like old stone and cool air, and belonged, in every sense that mattered, entirely to him. That is the thing about property rights. They are not interesting when they are respected. Nobody writes about them. Nobody talks about them at neighborhood events. Nobody pulls their deed documents on a Tuesday evening to make sure everything is in order. They just exist, quietly and functionally, as the invisible structure underneath daily life, the legal framework that lets you live in your house without thinking about the fact that you own it. They become stories when they are challenged. When someone decides that their need for a resource supersedes another person's right to it, that the efficiency of a system justifies using a foundation it was never supposed to rest on. The fact of long use creates something that looks enough like permission that maybe everyone will just accept it. The tunnel was always Marcus's. Before Sandra's routing scheme and after it. The legal reality did not change when she started using it. It did not change when the algorithm absorbed the shortcut into its recommended routes. It did not change when the board meeting tried to argue that community benefit should prevail. The ground was his and everything in it, and the fact that someone else found it useful did not transfer that ownership by 1 inch. What changed was visibility. All of it, the 30 days notice, the injunction, the sealed concrete, the settlement, the database removal requests, all of it was the work of visibility, not creating a right. Insisting that a right that already existed be seen, refusing to let it stay invisible simply because someone else had found the invisibility more convenient. And that visibility matters beyond the case itself. Because the logic Sandra applied, identify a resource, use it quietly, make it necessary, then claim community interest, does not stay in subterranean tunnels. It is the same logic that turns a neighbor's parking spot into a shared resource through habit. The same logic that converts a private footpath into a community shortcut through repeated use. The same logic that takes an unused corner of someone's lot and gradually fills it with HOA infrastructure because nobody said anything for long enough. The cases are different. The logic is identical. What makes rights meaningful is enforcement. Not aggressive enforcement, not litigious enforcement, not the kind of enforcement that turns every minor encroachment into a federal case. Just clear, documented, appropriately timed assertion. This is mine, it was always mine, and I am telling you that clearly and explicitly and in writing. Marcus did that. He did it legally, thoroughly, and precisely. He gave notice before acting. He filed before sealing. He accepted settlement rather than pursuing further litigation. He did not try to extract more from the situation than the situation warranted. He just refused to pretend that his property was less his than it was. He refused to let the underground stay invisible. He refused to let someone else's convenience become his obligation. Property rights exist in the dark as much as in the light. They do not expire because no one's watching. They do not weaken because someone else has been in the space. They are not diminished by need or efficiency arguments or community benefit calculations or the awkward social pressure of being the person who caused the summer delivery gridlock. They are just there, waiting. Patient in the way that legal documents are patient. Waiting for the day the owner looks at the calendar and decides, enough. That day comes in different forms for different people. For Marcus it came with a low rhythmic thumping from the wrong direction. For other homeowners it comes as a letter, or a neighbor's comment, or a line on an assessment that does not quite match the governing documents. The trigger is almost always small. The principle underneath it never is. The tunnel story ends with wine racks and concrete walls and a settlement that covered the legal fees. It ends cleanly, as these things go, but it carries forward. Because every homeowner who read their deed for the first time after hearing about this dispute, every property owner who started paying attention to the gap between what their HOA's documents actually said and what the board was actually doing, they are all still paying that attention now. The underground did not become neutral when Marcus sealed it. The underground became his again in the full and active sense of the word. And the surface above it, the neighborhood with its tourist season and its triangle gridlock, and its community meetings and its competing ideas about what the community's interest actually requires, that surface became incrementally and without announcement, a place where people knew a little more clearly where the lines were. That knowledge is the most durable thing in this story. The tunnel is a wine cellar. The settlement money is a driveway. The HOA board has a new president. But the attentiveness, the sense that documents mean what they say, that authority has limits, that you are in fact allowed to look carefully at what you own and insist that it remain yours, that stays. And that attentiveness is contagious. Once a community learns to read its own documents, it does not stop. Once homeowners understand the difference between what the HOA is authorized to do and what it has become accustomed to doing, they tend to keep applying that lens. Not litigiously, not with hostility, just with a clearer, steadier sense of where the actual lines are. That is not a bad outcome from a bad situation. That is, in a certain light, the best possible outcome. The conflict that began underground, in a space most people did not know existed, surfaced something that the community had needed to see for a while. Sometimes it takes a sealed tunnel and a summer of delivery gridlock to remind people that the map of what belongs to whom runs deeper than street level. Until the day the owner decides they would like their tunnel back.